This is the complete story of Theodore Roosevelt, the entire Wikipedia article, narrated start to finish. Get comfortable, and let's get into it. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., October 27, 1858, January 6, 1919, was the 26th President of the United States, serving from 1901 to 1909. Previously serving 6 months as Vice President under William McKinley, Roosevelt became president after McKinley's assassination in 1901. He was 42 years old upon his first inauguration, making him the youngest person to hold the office. A sickly child with debilitating asthma, Roosevelt overcame health problems through a regime of vigorous exercise, which he called the strenuous life. He was homeschooled and began a lifelong naturalist avocation before attending Harvard University. His book, The Naval War of 1812, established his reputation as a historian and popular writer. Roosevelt became leader of the reform faction of Republicans in the New York State Legislature. After the simultaneous deaths of his first wife Alice Hathaway, Lee Roosevelt, and mother Martha Bulloch Roosevelt, he recuperated by buying and operating a cattle ranch in the Dakotas. Roosevelt served as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under McKinley, and in 1898 helped plan the successful naval war against Spain. He resigned to help form and lead the Rough Riders, a unit that fought the Spanish army in Cuba to great publicity. Returning a war hero, Roosevelt was elected New York's governor in 1898. Because the New York State Party leadership disliked his ambitious state agenda, they convinced McKinley to choose him as his running mate in the 1900 presidential election. The McKinley-Roosevelt ticket won a landslide victory. As a leader of the progressive movement, Roosevelt championed his square deal domestic policies after taking over as president, which called for fairness for all citizens, breaking bad trusts, regulating railroads, and pure food and drugs. His pursuit of antitrust litigation in particular earned him the nickname, the Trust Buster. Roosevelt prioritized conservation and established national parks, forests, and monuments to preserve U.S. natural resources. In foreign policy, he focused on Central America, beginning construction of the Panama Canal. Roosevelt expanded the U.S. Navy and sent the Great White Fleet on a world tour to project naval power. His successful efforts to end the Russo-Japanese War won him the 1906 Nobel Peace Prize, the first non-European to win a Nobel Prize. He was elected to a full term in 1904 and convinced William Howard Taft, his Secretary of War, to succeed him in 1908. Roosevelt grew frustrated with Taft's brand of conservatism, yet failed to win the 1912 Republican presidential nomination. He founded the Bull Moose Party and ran in 1912. The split allowed the Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win. Roosevelt led a 4-month expedition to the Amazon basin, where he nearly died of tropical disease. During World War I, he criticized Wilson for keeping the US out. His offer to lead volunteers to France was rejected. Roosevelt's health deteriorated, and he died in 1919. Polls of historians and political scientists rank him as one of the greatest presidents in American history. Early life and education. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was born on October 27, 1858, at 28 East 20th Street in Manhattan. His parents were Martha Stewart Bulloch and businessman Theodore Roosevelt Sr. He had an older sister, Anna, called Bamie, a younger brother, Elliot, and a younger sister, Corinne. Roosevelt's youth was shaped by his poor health and debilitating asthma attacks, which terrified him and his parents. Doctors had no cure. Nevertheless, he was energetic and mischievously inquisitive. His lifelong interest in zoology began at age 7, when he saw a dead seal at a market. After obtaining the seal's head, Roosevelt and his cousins formed the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. Having learned the rudiments of taxidermy, he filled his makeshift museum with animals he killed or caught. At age 9, he recorded his observations in a paper entitled The Natural History of Insects. Family trips, including tours of Europe in 1869 and 1870, and Egypt in 1872, shaped his cosmopolitan perspective. Hiking with his family in the Alps in 1869, Roosevelt discovered the benefits of physical exertion to minimize his asthma and bolster his spirits. Roosevelt began a heavy regimen of exercise. After being manhandled by older boys on the way to a camping trip, he found a boxing coach to train him. Education. Roosevelt was homeschooled. Biographer H.W. Brands wrote that the most obvious drawback was uneven coverage of various areas of knowledge. He was solid in geography and bright in history, biology, French, and German. However, he struggled in mathematics and the classical languages. In September 1876, he entered Harvard University. His father instructed him to take care of your morals first, your health next, and finally your studies. His father's sudden death in 1878 devastated Roosevelt. He inherited $60,000, equivalent to $171 million in 2024, on which he could live comfortably for the rest of his life. His father, a devout Presbyterian, had regularly led the family in prayers. While at Harvard, young adult Theodore emulated him by teaching Sunday school for more than 3 years at the Episcopal Christ Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. When the minister at Christ Church insisted he become an Episcopalian to continue teaching, Roosevelt declined and began teaching a mission class in a poor section of Cambridge. Roosevelt did well in science, philosophy, and rhetoric courses, but struggled in Latin and Greek. He was already an accomplished naturalist and a published ornithologist, and studied biology intently. He read prodigiously, with an almost photographic memory. Roosevelt participated in rowing and boxing, and was a member of the Alpha Delta Phi Literary Society, the Delta Kappa Epsilon Fraternity, and the prestigious Porcellian Club. In 1880, Roosevelt graduated Phi Beta Kappa, 22nd of 177, with an AB magna cum laude. Henry F. Pringle wrote, Roosevelt, attempting to analyze his college career and weigh the benefits he had received, felt that he had obtained little from Harvard. He had been depressed by the formalistic treatment of many subjects, by the rigidity, the attention to minutiae that were important in themselves, but which somehow were never linked up with the whole. Roosevelt gave up his plan of studying natural science and attended Columbia Law School, moving back into his family's home in New York. Although Roosevelt was an able student, he found law to be irrational. Determined to enter politics, Roosevelt began attending meetings at Morton Hall, the headquarters of New York's 21st District Republican Association. Though Roosevelt's father had been a prominent member of the Republican Party, Roosevelt made an unorthodox career choice for someone of his class, as most of Roosevelt's peers refrained from becoming too closely involved in politics. Roosevelt found allies in the local Republican Party and defeated a Republican state assemblyman tied closely to the political machine of Senator Roscoe Conkling. After his election victory, Roosevelt dropped out of law school, later saying, "I intended to be one of the governing class, naval history and strategy." While at Harvard, Roosevelt began a systematic study of the role played by the United States Navy in the War of 1812. He published The Naval War of 1812 in 1882. The book included comparisons of British and American leadership down to the ship-to-ship level. It was praised for its scholarship and style, and remains a standard study of the war. Some believed Roosevelt's naval ideas were derived from author Alfred Thayer Mahan, who popularized a concept that only nations with significant naval power had been able to influence history, dominate oceans, exert their diplomacy to the fullest, and defend their borders. But naval historian Nicholas Danby states that Roosevelt's ideas predated meeting Mahan or reading his work. New York State Assemblyman, 1881-1884. In 1881, Roosevelt won election to the New York State Assembly, representing the 21st District, which was centered on the Silk Stocking District of New York County's Upper East Side. He served in the 1882, 1883, and 1884 sessions of the legislature. Roosevelt began making his mark immediately. He blocked a corrupt effort of financier Jay Gould to lower his taxes. Roosevelt exposed the collusion of Gould and Judge Theodore R. Westbrook, and successfully argued for an investigation, aiming for the judge to be impeached. Although the investigation committee rejected the impeachment, Roosevelt had exposed corruption in Albany and assumed a high and positive profile in New York publications. Roosevelt's anti-corruption efforts helped him win re-election in 1882 by a margin greater than 2-1, an achievement made more impressive by the victory that Democratic gubernatorial candidate Grover Cleveland won in Roosevelt's district. With Senator Conkling's stalwart faction of the Republican Party in disarray following the assassination of James A. Garfield, Roosevelt won election as party leader in the state assembly. He allied with Governor Cleveland to win passage of a civil service reform bill. Roosevelt won re-election and sought the office of Speaker, but Titus Sheard obtained the position. Roosevelt served as chairman of the Committee on Affairs of Cities, during which he wrote more bills than any other legislator. Military service, 1882, 1886, 1898. New York National Guard. While serving in the New York State Assembly, he commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 8th Regiment New York Army National Guard, serving a part-time capacity for 4 years. He left with the rank of captain, Rough Riders. With the beginning of the Spanish-American War in 1898, Roosevelt resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Along with Army Colonel Leonard Wood, he formed the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment. His wife and many friends begged Roosevelt to remain in Washington, but Roosevelt was determined to see battle. When the newspapers reported the formation of the new regiment, Roosevelt and Wood were flooded with applications. Referred to by the press as the Rough Riders, it was one of many temporary units active only during the war. The regiment trained for several weeks in San Antonio, Texas. In his autobiography, Roosevelt wrote that his experience with the New York National Guard enabled him to immediately begin teaching basic soldiering skills. Diversity characterized the regiment, which included Ivy Leaguers, athletes, frontiersmen, Native Americans, hunters, miners, former soldiers, tradesmen, and sheriffs. The Rough Riders were part of the cavalry division commanded by former Confederate General Joseph Wheeler. Roosevelt and his men landed in Daiquiri, Cuba on June 23, 1898, and marched to Siboney. Wheeler sent the Rough Riders on a parallel road northwest, running along a ridge up from the beach. Roosevelt took command of the regiment. He had his first experience in combat when the Rough Riders met Spanish troops in a skirmish known as the Battle of Las Guasimas. They fought their way through Spanish resistance and, together with the regulars, forced the Spaniards to abandon their positions. On July 1st, in a combined assault with the regulars, under Roosevelt's leadership, the Rough Riders became famous for charges up Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill. Roosevelt was the only soldier on horseback, as he rode back and forth between rifle pits at the forefront of the advance up Kettle Hill, an advance that he urged despite the absence of orders. He was forced to walk up the last part of Kettle Hill because his horse had been entangled in barbed wire. The assaults would become known as the Battle of San Juan Heights. The victories came at a cost of 200 killed and 1,000 wounded. Roosevelt personally killed one Spaniard with a revolver salvaged from the USS Maine during this assault. In August, Roosevelt and other officers demanded the soldiers be returned home. Roosevelt recalled San Juan Heights as the great day of my life. After returning to civilian life, Roosevelt preferred to be known as Colonel Roosevelt, or the Colonel. Teddy remained much more popular with the public, though Roosevelt openly despised that moniker. Cattle rancher in Dakota. Roosevelt first visited the Dakota Territory in 1883 to hunt bison. Exhilarated by the Western lifestyle and with the cattle business booming, Roosevelt invested $14,000, equivalent to $400,000 in 2024, in hope of becoming a prosperous cattle rancher. For several years, he shuttled between his home in New York and ranch in Dakota. Following the 1884 United States presidential election, Roosevelt built Elkhorn Ranch, 35 miles, 56 kilometers, north of the boomtown of Medora, North Dakota. Roosevelt learned to ride Western-style, rope, and hunt on the banks of the Little Missouri. A cowboy, he said, possesses few of the emasculated milk and water moralities admired by the pseudo-philanthropists, but he does possess, to a very high degree, the stern, manly qualities that are invaluable to a nation. He wrote about frontier life for national magazines and published books, Hunting Trips of a Ranchman, Ranch Life and the Hunting Trail, and The Wilderness Hunter. Roosevelt successfully led efforts to organize ranchers to address the problems of overgrazing and other shared concerns, which resulted in the formation of the Little Missouri Stockmen's Association. He formed the Boone and Crockett Club, whose primary goal was the conservation of large game animals and their habitats. In 1886, Roosevelt served as a deputy sheriff in Billings County, North Dakota. He and ranch hands hunted down 3 boat thieves. The severe winter of 1886 to 1887 wiped out his herd and over half of his $80,000 investment, equivalent to $2.44 million in 2024. He ended his ranching life and returned to New York, where he escaped the damaging label of an ineffectual intellectual. Re-entering public life. Upon Roosevelt's return to New York, Republican leaders approached him about running for mayor of New York City in the 1886 election. Roosevelt accepted the nomination, despite having little hope against United Labor Party candidate Henry George and Democrat Abram Hewitt. Roosevelt campaigned hard, but Hewitt won with 41%, taking the votes of many Republicans who feared George's radical policies. George was held to 31%, and Roosevelt took third with 27%. Fearing his political career might never recover, Roosevelt turned to writing The Winning of the West, tracking the westward movement of Americans. It was a great success, earning favorable reviews and selling all copies from the first printing. Civil Service Commission. After Benjamin Harrison unexpectedly defeated James G. Blaine for the presidential nomination at the 1888 Republican National Convention, Roosevelt gave stump speeches in the Midwest in support of Harrison. On the insistence of Henry Cabot Lodge, President Harrison appointed Roosevelt to the United States Civil Service Commission, where he served until 1895. While many of his predecessors had approached the office as a sinecure, Roosevelt fought the spoilsmen and demanded enforcement of civil service laws. The Sun described Roosevelt as irrepressible, belligerent, and enthusiastic. Roosevelt clashed with Postmaster General John Wanamaker, who handed out patronage positions to Harrison supporters, and Roosevelt's attempt to force out several postal workers damaged Harrison politically. Despite Roosevelt's support for Harrison's re-election in the 1892 presidential election, the winner, Grover Cleveland, reappointed him. Roosevelt's close friend and biographer, Joseph Bucklin Bishop, described his assault on the spoils system. The very citadel of spoils politics, the hitherto impregnable fortress that had existed unshaken since it was erected on the foundation laid by Andrew Jackson, was tottering to its fall under the assaults of this audacious and irrepressible young man. Whatever may have been the feelings of the fellow Republican Party president, Harrison, and there is little doubt that he had no idea when he appointed Roosevelt that he would prove to be so veritable a bull in a china shop. He refused to remove him and stood by him firmly till the end of his term. New York City Police Commissioner. In 1894, Reform Republicans approached Roosevelt about running for mayor of New York again. He declined, mostly due to his wife's resistance to being removed from the Washington social set. Soon after, he realized he had missed an opportunity to reinvigorate a dormant political career. He retreated to the Dakotas. Edith regretted her role in the decision and vowed there would be no repeat. William Lafayette Strong won the 1894 mayoral election and offered Roosevelt a position on the board of the New York City Police Commissioners. Roosevelt became president of commissioners and radically reformed the police force. He implemented regular inspections of firearms and physical exams, appointed recruits based on their physical and mental qualifications rather than political affiliation, established meritorious service medals, closed corrupt police hostelries, and had telephones installed in station houses. In 1894, Roosevelt met Jacob Riis, the muckraking Evening Sun journalist, who was opening the eyes of New Yorkers to the terrible conditions of the city's immigrants with such books as How the Other Half Lives. Riis described how his book affected Roosevelt. When Roosevelt read my book, he came. No one ever helped as he did. For 2 years we were brothers in New York City's crime-ridden Mulberry Street. When he left, I had seen its golden age. There is very little ease where Theodore Roosevelt leads, as we all of us found out. The lawbreaker found it out, who predicted scornfully that he would knuckle down to politics the way they all did, and lived to respect him, though he swore at him, as the one of them all who was stronger than Pull. That was what made the age golden, that for the first time a moral purpose came into the street. In the light of it, everything was transformed. Roosevelt made a habit of walking officers' beats at night and early in the morning to make sure that they were on duty. He made a concerted effort to uniformly enforce New York's Sunday closing law. In this, he ran up against Tom Platt and Tammany Hall. He was notified the police commission was being legislated out of existence. His crackdowns led to protests. Invited to one large demonstration, not only did he accept, but he delighted in the insults and lampoons directed at him, and earned goodwill. Roosevelt chose to defer rather than split with his party. Assistant Secretary of the Navy, 1897-1898. In the 1896 presidential election, Roosevelt backed Thomas Brackett Reed for the Republican nomination, but William McKinley won the nomination and defeated William Jennings Bryan in the general election. Roosevelt strongly opposed Bryan's free silver platform, viewing many of Bryan's followers as dangerous fanatics. He gave campaign speeches for McKinley. Urged by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, President McKinley appointed Roosevelt as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897. Secretary of the Navy John D. Long was in poor health and left many major decisions to Roosevelt. Influenced by Alfred Thayer Mahan, Roosevelt called for a build-up in naval strength, particularly the construction of battleships. Roosevelt also began pressing his national security views regarding the Pacific and the Caribbean on McKinley, and was adamant that Spain be ejected from Cuba. He explained his priorities to one of the Navy's planners in late 1897. "I would regard war with Spain from two viewpoints. First, the advisability on the grounds both of humanity and self-interest of interfering on behalf of the Cubans, and of taking one more step toward the complete freeing of America from European dominion. Second, the benefit done our people by giving them something to think of which is not material gain, and especially the benefit done our military forces by trying both the Navy and Army in actual practice." On February 15, 1898, the armored cruiser USS Maine exploded in the harbor of Havana, Cuba, killing hundreds of crew. While Roosevelt and many other Americans blamed Spain for the explosion, McKinley sought a diplomatic solution. Without approval from Long or McKinley, Roosevelt sent out orders to several naval vessels to prepare for war. George Dewey, who had received an appointment to lead the Asiatic Squadron with the backing of Roosevelt, later credited his victory at the Battle of Manila Bay to Roosevelt's orders. After giving up hope of a peaceful solution, McKinley asked Congress to declare war on Spain, beginning the Spanish-American War. Governor of New York, 1899 to 1900. Shortly after Roosevelt's return, Republican Congressman Lemuel E. Quigg, a lieutenant of New York machine boss Thomas C. Platt, asked Roosevelt to run in the 1898 gubernatorial election. Prospering politically from the Platt machine, Roosevelt's rise to power was marked by the pragmatic decisions of Platt, who disliked Roosevelt. Platt feared Roosevelt would oppose his interests in office and was reluctant to propel Roosevelt to the forefront of national politics, but needed a strong candidate due to the unpopularity of the incumbent Republican governor, Frank S. Black. Roosevelt agreed to become the nominee and to try not to make war with the Republican establishment once in office. Roosevelt defeated Black in the Republican caucus and faced Democrat Augustus Van Wyck, a well-respected judge, in the general election. Roosevelt campaigned on his war record, winning by just 1%. As governor, Roosevelt learned about economic issues and political techniques that proved valuable in his presidency. He studied the problems of trusts, monopolies, labor relations, and conservation. G. Wallace Chessman argues that Roosevelt's program rested firmly upon the concept of the square deal by a neutral state. The rules for the square deal were honesty in public affairs, an equitable sharing of privilege and responsibility, and subordination of party and local concerns to the interests of the state at large. By holding twice-daily press conferences, an innovation, Roosevelt remained connected with his middle-class base. Roosevelt successfully pushed the Ford franchise tax bill, which taxed public franchises granted by the state and controlled by corporations, declaring that a corporation which derives its powers from the state should pay to the state a just percentage of its earnings as a return for the privileges it enjoys. He rejected Platt's worries that this approached Bryanite socialism, explaining that without it, New York voters might get angry and adopt public ownership of streetcar lines and other franchises. Power to make appointments to policy-making positions was a key role for the governor. Platt insisted he be consulted on major appointments. Roosevelt appeared to comply, but then made his own decisions. Historians marvel that Roosevelt managed to appoint so many first-rate people with Platt's approval. He even enlisted Platt's help in securing reform, such as in spring 1899, when Platt pressured state senators to vote for a civil service bill that the secretary of the Civil Service Reform Association called superior to any civil service statute heretofore secured in America. Chessman argues that as governor, Roosevelt developed the principles that shaped his presidency, especially insistence upon the public responsibility of large corporations, publicity as a first remedy for trusts, regulation of railroad rates, mediation of the conflict of capital and labor, conservation of natural resources, and protection of the poor. Roosevelt sought to position himself against the excesses of large corporations and radical movements. As chief executive of the most populous state, Roosevelt was widely considered a potential presidential candidate, and supporters such as William Allen White encouraged him to run. Roosevelt had no interest in challenging McKinley for the nomination in 1900 and was denied his preferred post of Secretary of War. As his term progressed, Roosevelt pondered a 1904 run, but was uncertain about whether he should seek re-election as governor in 1900. Vice Presidency, 1901. In November 1899, Vice President Garrett Hobart died, leaving an open spot on the 1900 Republican national ticket. Though Henry Cabot Lodge and others urged him to run for vice president in 1900, Roosevelt issued a public statement saying that he would not accept the nomination. Eager to be rid of Roosevelt, Platt nonetheless began a newspaper campaign in favor of Roosevelt's nomination. Roosevelt attended the 1900 Republican National Convention as a state delegate and struck a bargain with Platt. Roosevelt would accept the nomination if the convention offered it to him, but would otherwise serve another term as governor. Platt asked Pennsylvania party boss Matthew Quay to lead the campaign for Roosevelt's nomination, and Quay outmaneuvered Mark Hanna at the convention to put Roosevelt on the ticket. Roosevelt won the nomination unanimously. Roosevelt's vice presidential campaigning proved highly energetic and a match for Democratic presidential nominee William Jennings Bryan's barnstorming style. In a whirlwind campaign that displayed his energy to the public, Roosevelt made 480 stops in 23 states. He denounced the radicalism of Bryan, contrasting it with the heroism of those who won the war against Spain. Bryan had strongly supported the war itself, but he denounced the annexation of the Philippines as imperialism. Roosevelt countered that it was best for the Filipinos to have stability and the Americans to have a proud place in the world. The voters gave McKinley an even larger victory than that which he had achieved in 1896. Roosevelt took office as vice president in March 1901. The office was a powerless sinecure and did not suit Roosevelt's aggressive temperament. Roosevelt's 6 months as vice president were uneventful and boring for a man of action. He had no power. He presided over the Senate for a mere 4 days before it adjourned. On September 2, 1901, Roosevelt first publicized an aphorism that thrilled his supporters. "Speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far." Presidential elections. Presidential election of 1884. With numerous presidential hopefuls, Roosevelt supported Senator George F. Edmunds of Vermont. The state Republican Party preferred incumbent president Chester Arthur, who was known for passing the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. Roosevelt succeeded in influencing the Manhattan delegates at the state convention. He then took control of the convention, bargaining through the night and outmaneuvering supporters of Arthur and James G. Blaine. Consequently, he gained a national reputation as a key politician in his state. Roosevelt attended the 1884 Republican National Convention in Chicago, where he gave a speech convincing delegates to nominate African-American John R. Lynch, an Edmunds supporter, to be temporary chair. Roosevelt fought alongside the Mugwump reformers against Blaine. However, Blaine gained support from Arthur's and Edmunds's delegates and won the nomination. In a crucial moment of his budding career, Roosevelt resisted the demand of fellow Mugwumps that he bolt from Blaine. He bragged, "We achieved a victory in getting up a combination to beat the Blaine nominee for temporary chairman. This needed skill, boldness, and energy to get the different factions to come in, to defeat the common foe." He was impressed by an invitation to speak before an audience of 10,000, the largest crowd he had addressed up to then. Having gotten a taste of national politics, Roosevelt felt less aspiration for advocacy on the state level. He retired to his new Chimney Butte Ranch on the Little Missouri River. Roosevelt refused to join other Mugwumps in supporting Cleveland, the Democratic nominee in the general election. After Blaine won the nomination, Roosevelt carelessly said he would give hearty support to any decent Democrat. He distanced himself from the promise, saying that it had not been meant for publication. When a reporter asked if he would support Blaine, Roosevelt replied, "I decline to answer." In the end, he realized he had to support Blaine to maintain his role in the party, and did so in a press release. Having lost the support of many reformers, and still reeling from the deaths of his wife and mother, Roosevelt decided to retire from politics and move to North Dakota. Presidential election of 1904. With the waning of Thomas Platt's power, Roosevelt faced little effective opposition for the 1904 nomination. In deference to Mark Hanna's conservative loyalists, Roosevelt at first offered the party chairmanship to Cornelius Bliss, but he declined. Roosevelt turned to his own man, George B. Cortelyou of New York, the first Secretary of Commerce and Labor. To buttress his hold on the party's nomination, Roosevelt made it clear that anyone opposing Cortelyou would be considered opposing the president. The president secured his own nomination, but his preferred vice presidential running mate, Robert R. Hitt, was not nominated. Senator Charles Warren Fairbanks of Indiana, a favorite of conservatives, gained the nomination. While Roosevelt followed the tradition of incumbents in not actively campaigning on the stump, he sought to control the campaign's message through specific instructions to Cortelyou. He also attempted to manage the press's release of White House statements by forming the Ananias Club. Any journalist who repeated a statement made by the president without approval was penalized by restriction of further access. The Democratic Party's nominee in 1904 was Alton Brooks Parker. Democratic newspapers charged that Republicans were extorting large campaign contributions from corporations, putting ultimate responsibility on Roosevelt himself. Roosevelt denied corruption, while at the same time ordering Cortelyou to return $100,000, equivalent to $2.72 million in 2024, of a campaign contribution from Standard Oil. Parker said that Roosevelt was accepting corporate donations to keep damaging information from the Bureau of Corporations from going public. Roosevelt strongly denied Parker's charge and responded that he would go into the presidency unhampered by any pledge, promise, or understanding of any kind, sort, or description. Allegations from Parker and the Democrats, however, had little impact on the election, as Roosevelt promised to give every American a square deal. Roosevelt won 56% of the popular vote to Parker's 38%, and won the Electoral College vote 336 to 140. Before his inauguration ceremony, Roosevelt declared that he would not serve another term. Democrats would continue to charge Roosevelt and the Republicans of being influenced by corporate donations. Presidential election of 1908. Roosevelt enjoyed being president, but believed limited terms provided a check against dictatorship. He decided to honor his 1904 pledge not to run for a third term. Though he favored Secretary of State Elihu Root as his successor, Root's ill health made him unsuitable. New York Governor Charles Evans Hughes was a strong candidate and shared Roosevelt's progressivism, but Roosevelt considered him too independent. He settled on his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, who had been his friend since 1890 and consistently supported Roosevelt's policies. Roosevelt was determined to install the successor of his choice and wrote to Taft, "Dear Will, do you want any action about those federal officials? I will break their necks with the utmost cheerfulness if you say the word." Just weeks later, he branded as false and malicious the charge he was using the offices at his disposal to favor Taft. At the 1908 Republican Convention, many chanted 4 years more of a Roosevelt presidency. But Taft won the nomination after Henry Cabot Lodge made it clear Roosevelt was not interested. In the 1908 election, Taft easily defeated Democratic nominee William Jennings Bryan. Taft promoted progressivism, emphasizing the rule of law. He preferred that judges, rather than politicians, make decisions about fairness. However, Taft proved to be a less adroit politician than Roosevelt, lacking the energy, personal magnetism, and public support that made Roosevelt so formidable. When Roosevelt realized lowering the tariff would create severe tensions inside the Republican Party, he stopped talking about it. Taft, ignoring the risks, tackled the tariff boldly, resulting in the Payne-Aldrich Tariff of 1909, which alienated reformers on all sides. While the crisis was building inside the party, Roosevelt was touring Africa and Europe, allowing Taft space. Presidential election of 1912, Republican primaries and convention. In November 1911, a group of Ohio Republicans endorsed Roosevelt for the party's nomination for president. Roosevelt conspicuously declined to refuse a nomination. Soon thereafter, Roosevelt said, "I am really sorry for Taft. I am sure he means well, but he means well feebly, and he does not know how. He is utterly unfit for leadership, and this is a time when we need leadership." In January 1912, Roosevelt declared, "If the people make a draft on me, I shall not decline to serve." Roosevelt spoke before the Constitutional Convention in Ohio, identifying as a progressive and endorsing progressive reforms, even endorsing popular review of state judicial decisions. In reaction to Roosevelt's proposals, Taft said, "Such extremists are not progressives. They are political emotionalists or neurotics." Roosevelt began to envision himself as the savior of the party from defeat in the upcoming election. In February 1912 in Boston, Roosevelt said, "I will accept the nomination for president if it is tendered to me." Elihu Root and Henry Cabot Lodge thought division would lead to defeat in the election. while Taft believed he would be defeated either in the primary or general election. The 1912 primaries represented the first extensive use of the presidential primary, a reform achievement of the progressive movement. The Republican primaries in the South, where party regulars dominated, went for Taft, as did New York, Indiana, Michigan, Kentucky, and Massachusetts. Meanwhile, Roosevelt won in Illinois, Minnesota, Nebraska, South Dakota, California, Maryland, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. At the 1912 Republican National Convention in Chicago, Taft won the nomination on the first ballot. According to Lewis L. Gould, in 1912, Roosevelt saw Taft as the agent of the forces of reaction and of political crookedness. Roosevelt had become the most dangerous man in American history, said Taft, because of his hold upon the less intelligent voters and the discontented. The Republican National Committee, dominated by the Taft forces, awarded 235 delegates to the president and 19 to Roosevelt. Roosevelt believed himself entitled to 72 delegates from Arizona, California, Texas, and Washington that had been given to Taft. Firm in his conviction that the nomination was being stolen from him, Roosevelt told cheering supporters that there was a great moral issue at stake, and he should have 60 to 80 lawfully elected delegates added to his total. Roosevelt ended his speech declaring, "Fearless of the future, unheeding of our individual fates, with unflinching hearts and undimmed eyes, we stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." Progressive Party. Once his defeat appeared probable, Roosevelt announced he would accept the progressive nomination on a progressive platform, and I shall fight to the end, win or lose. Roosevelt prophetically said, "My feeling is that the Democrats will probably win if they nominate a progressive." Roosevelt left the Republican Party and created the Progressive Party. Leadership of the new party included a range of reformers. Jane Addams campaigned vigorously for the party as a breakthrough in social reform. Gifford Pinchot represented environmentalists and antitrust crusaders. Publisher Frank Munsey provided cash, and George W. Perkins, a Wall Street financier, came from the efficiency movement. He handled the new party's finances efficiently, but was distrusted by many reformers. Governor Hiram Johnson controlled the California Party, forcing out the Taft supporters. He was nominated as Roosevelt's running mate. Roosevelt's platform echoed his radical 1907 to 1908 proposals, calling for vigorous government intervention to protect the people from selfish interests. To destroy this invisible government, to dissolve the unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt politics, is the first task of the statesmanship of the day. This country belongs to the people. Its resources, its business, its laws, its institutions should be utilized, maintained, or altered in whatever manner will best promote the general interest. This assertion is explicit. Mr. Wilson must know that every monopoly in the United States opposes the Progressive Party. I challenge him to name the monopoly that did support the Progressive Party, whether the Sugar Trust, the U.S. Steel Trust, the Harvester Trust, the Standard Oil Trust, the Tobacco Trust, or any other. Ours was the only program to which they objected, and they supported either Mr. Wilson or Mr. Taft. Though many Progressive Party activists in the North opposed the steady loss of civil rights for blacks, Roosevelt ran a lily-white campaign in the South. Rival all-white and all-black delegations from southern states arrived at the Progressive National Convention, and Roosevelt decided to seat the all-white delegations. Nevertheless, he won few votes outside traditional Republican strongholds. Out of 100 counties in the South, Roosevelt won 2 counties in Alabama, 1 in Arkansas, 7 in North Carolina, 3 in Georgia, 17 in Tennessee, 2 in Texas, 1 in Virginia, and none in Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, or South Carolina. Attempted assassination. On October 14, 1912, while arriving at a campaign event in Milwaukee, Roosevelt was shot by saloon keeper John Schrank, who believed the ghost of assassinated President William McKinley had directed him to kill Roosevelt. The bullet lodged in Roosevelt's chest after penetrating his eyeglass case and passing through a 50-page folded copy of the speech titled "Progressive Cause Greater Than Any Individual." Schrank was disarmed and captured by Roosevelt's stenographer, Elbert E. Martin, as he attempted to fire a second time, and might have been lynched had Roosevelt not shouted for Schrank to remain unharmed. Roosevelt assured the crowd he was all right, then ordered police to take Schrank and make sure no violence was done to him. As an experienced hunter and anatomist, Roosevelt correctly concluded that since he was not coughing blood, the bullet had not reached his lung. He declined to go to hospital immediately and instead delivered a 90-minute speech with blood seeping into his shirt. Only afterwards did he accept medical attention. Probes and an X-ray showed the bullet had lodged in Roosevelt's chest muscle, but did not penetrate the pleura. Doctors concluded it would be less dangerous to leave it than attempt to remove it, and Roosevelt carried the bullet in him for the rest of his life. Taft and Democratic nominee Woodrow Wilson suspended their campaigning until Roosevelt resumed his. When asked if the shooting would affect his election campaign, he said to the reporter, "I'm fit as a bull moose." The bull moose became a symbol of Roosevelt and the Progressive Party, and it often was referred to as the Bull Moose Party. He spent 2 weeks recuperating before returning to campaign. He wrote a friend about the bullet, "I do not mind it any more than if it were in my waistcoat pocket." Democratic victory. After the Democrats nominated Governor Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt did not expect to win the election, as Wilson had compiled a record attractive to progressive Democrats who might have considered voting for Roosevelt. Roosevelt still campaigned vigorously, and the election developed into a two-person contest despite Taft's quiet presence. Roosevelt respected Wilson, but they differed on various issues. Wilson opposed federal intervention regarding women's suffrage or child labor, and attacked Roosevelt's tolerance of large businesses. Roosevelt won 4.1 million votes, 27%, compared to Taft's 3.5 million, 23%, and Wilson's 6.3 million, 42%. Wilson scored a landslide in the Electoral College with 435 electoral votes, Roosevelt 88 and Taft 8. Pennsylvania was the only eastern state won by Roosevelt. In the Midwest, he carried Michigan, Minnesota, and South Dakota. In the West, California, and Washington. Roosevelt garnered a higher share of the popular vote than any other third-party presidential candidate in history and won the most states of any third-party candidate after the Civil War. Presidency, 1901 to 1909. On September 6, 1901, President McKinley was attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, when he was shot by anarchist Leon Czolgosz. Roosevelt, vacationing in Isle-la-Motte, Vermont, traveled to Buffalo to visit McKinley in the hospital. When McKinley seemed to recover, Roosevelt resumed his vacation. When McKinley's condition worsened, Roosevelt rushed back to Buffalo. He was in North Creek when he learned of McKinley's death on September 14th. Roosevelt then continued to Buffalo and was sworn in as the 26th president at the Ansley Wilcox House. McKinley's supporters were uneasy about Roosevelt, with Ohio Senator Mark Hanna particularly bitter, given his strong opposition at the convention. Although Roosevelt assured party leaders that he would adhere to McKinley's policies and retained his cabinet, he sought to establish himself as the party's leader and position himself for the 1904 election. Roosevelt's ascension to the presidency was met with concern by conservative Republicans, with historian Doris Kearns Goodwin noting that conservatives, who had utterly dominated the Republican Party for 3 decades, feared the impulsive young president would prove a bucking bronco, upsetting the alliance between business and government that had delivered unparalleled prosperity at the turn of the century. Reformers hoped Roosevelt's vigorous leadership would refashion the Republican Party into the progressive force it had been under Abraham Lincoln, endeavoring to spread prosperity beyond the wealthy few to the common man. Adding to this point, Kearns has noted that throughout his career, Roosevelt had struggled to reconcile party allegiance with the drive to address social problems, a balancing act that became more difficult as the troubling aspects of industrialization intensified. While he considered himself conservative in relation to the populists, he believed that his party was in thrall to reactionaries who so dreaded radicalism that they distrusted anything that was progressive. Precisely such men dominated both chambers of Congress, Roosevelt lamented. He would work to push them forward, but recognized that genuine progress would require a direct appeal to the people, the masters of both of us. To reach the general public, he would enlist the new breed of independent journalists, without whose active support, he later acknowledged, he would have been powerless. Shortly after taking office, Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House, sparking a bitter reaction across the heavily segregated South. While Roosevelt initially planned more dinners with Washington, He later avoided further invitations in favor of business appointments to retain political support in the White South. Domestic policies, the Square Deal. When he assumed the presidency, Roosevelt reassured many fiscal conservatives, stating that the mechanism of modern business is so delicate that extreme care must be taken not to interfere with it in a spirit of rashness or ignorance. The following year, Roosevelt asserted the president's independence from business interests by opposing the merger, which created the Northern Securities Company, and many were surprised that any president, much less an unelected one, would challenge powerful banker J.P. Morgan. In his last 2 years as president, Roosevelt became increasingly distrustful of big business, despite its close ties to the Republican Party. Roosevelt sought to replace the 19th century laissez-faire economic environment with a new economic model, which included a larger regulatory role for the federal government, which was central to his political ideology of progressive conservatism. He believed that 19th century entrepreneurs had risked their fortunes on innovations and new businesses, and that these capitalists had been rightly rewarded. By contrast, he believed that 20th century capitalists risked little but nonetheless reaped huge and, given the lack of risk, unjust economic rewards. Without a redistribution of wealth away from the upper class, Roosevelt feared that the country would turn to radicals or fall to revolution. His Square Deal domestic program had 3 main goals: conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and consumer protection. The Square Deal evolved into his program of New Nationalism, which emphasized the priority of labor over capital interests and a need to more effectively control corporate creation and combination, and proposed a ban on corporate political contributions, trust busting, and regulation. Roosevelt was hailed as the trust buster for his aggressive use of the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act compared to his predecessors. He viewed big business as essential to the American economy, prosecuting only bad trusts that restrained trade and charged unfair prices. Roosevelt brought 44 antitrust suits, breaking up the Northern Securities Company, the largest railroad monopoly, and regulating Standard Oil, the largest oil company. His predecessors, Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland, and William McKinley, had together prosecuted only 18 antitrust violations. After winning large majorities in the 1902 elections, Roosevelt proposed creating the United States Department of Commerce and Labor, which included the Bureau of Corporations. Congress was receptive to the department, but skeptical of the antitrust powers Roosevelt wanted within the Bureau. Roosevelt appealed to the public, pressuring Congress, which overwhelmingly passed his version of the bill. House Speaker Joseph Gurney Cannon commented on Roosevelt's desire for executive branch control. That fellow at the other end of the avenue wants everything from the birth of Christ to the death of the devil. Biographer Brands notes, even his friends occasionally wondered whether there wasn't any custom or practice too minor for him to try to regulate, update, or otherwise improve. Roosevelt's willingness to exercise power extended to attempted rule changes in American football, forcing retention of martial arts classes at the U.S. Naval Academy, revising disciplinary rules, altering the design of a disliked coin, and ordering simplified spellings for 300 words, though he rescinded the latter after ridicule from the press and a House protest. Coal strike. In May 1902, anthracite coal miners went on strike, threatening a national energy shortage. After threatening the coal operators with federal troops, Roosevelt won their agreement to dispute arbitration by a commission, stopping the strike. The accord with J.P. Morgan resulted in miners getting more pay for fewer hours, but no union recognition. Roosevelt said, "My action on labor should always be considered in connection with my action as regards capital, and both are reducible to my favorite formula, a square deal for every man." He was the first president to help settle a labor dispute, prosecuted misconduct. During Roosevelt's second year in office, corruption was uncovered in the Indian Service, the United States General Land Office, and the Post Office Department. He prosecuted corrupt Indian agents who had cheated Native American tribes out of land parcels. Land fraud and speculation involving Oregon timberlands led to him and Ethan A. Hitchcock forcing General Land Office Commissioner Binger Herman from office in November 1902. Special Prosecutor Francis J. Heaney obtained 146 indictments in the Oregon Land Office bribery ring. Roosevelt also prosecuted 44 postal employees on charges of bribery and fraud. Historians agree he moved quickly and decisively to address misconduct in his administration. Railroads. Merchants complained that some railroad rates were too high. In the 1906 Hepburn Act, Roosevelt sought to give the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, the power to regulate rates, but the Senate, led by conservative Nelson Aldrich, resisted. Roosevelt worked with Democratic Senator Benjamin Tillman to pass the bill. They ultimately reached a compromise that gave the ICC the power to replace existing rates with just and reasonable maximum rates, allowing railroads to appeal to federal courts on what was reasonable. The Hepburn Act also granted the ICC regulatory power over pipeline fees, storage contracts, and other aspects of railroad operations. Pure food and drugs. Roosevelt responded to public outrage over abuses in the food packing industry by pushing Congress to pass the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Conservatives initially opposed the bill, but Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, published in 1906, galvanized support for reform. The Meat Inspection Act banned misleading labels and preservatives with harmful chemicals. The Pure Food and Drug Act banned impure or falsely labeled food and drugs from being made, sold, and shipped. Roosevelt served as honorary president of the American School Hygiene Association from 1907 to 1908 and convened the first White House Conference on the Care of Dependent Children in 1909. Conservation. Roosevelt was proudest of his work in conserving natural resources and extending federal protection to land and wildlife. He worked closely with Interior Secretary James Rudolph Garfield and Chief of the United States Forest Service Gifford Pinchot to enact a series of conservation programs that met resistance from Western Congress members, such as Charles William Fulton. Nonetheless, Roosevelt established the United States Forest Service, signed the creation of 5 national parks, and signed the 1906 Antiquities Act, under which he proclaimed 18 new U.S. national monuments. He also established the first 51 bird reserves, 4 game preserves, and 150 national forests. The area of the United States he placed under public protection totals approximately 230 million acres, 930,000 square kilometers. Roosevelt was the first honorary member of the Campfire Club of America. Roosevelt extensively used executive orders to protect forest and wildlife lands during his presidency. By the end of his second term, Roosevelt used executive orders to reserve 150 million acres, 600,000 square kilometers, of forestry land. Roosevelt was unapologetic about his use of executive orders to protect the environment, despite Congress's perception that he was encroaching on too many lands. Eventually, Senator Charles Fulton attached an amendment to an agricultural appropriations bill, preventing the president from reserving further land. Before signing the bill, Roosevelt established an additional 21 forest reserves, waiting until the last minute to sign it into law. In total, Roosevelt established 121 forest reserves in 31 states through executive orders. Roosevelt issued 1,081 executive orders, more than any previous president except for Grover Cleveland, 253. The first 25 presidents issued a total of 1,062 executive orders. Business panic of 1907. In 1907, Roosevelt faced the greatest domestic economic crisis since the Panic of 1893. Wall Street's stock market entered a slump in early 1907, and many investors blamed Roosevelt's regulatory policies for the decline in stock prices. Roosevelt ultimately helped calm the crisis by meeting with the leaders of U.S. Steel on November 4, 1907, and approving their plan to purchase a Tennessee steel company near bankruptcy. Its failure would ruin a major New York bank. However, in August, Roosevelt had exploded in anger at the super-rich for their economic malfeasance, calling them malefactors of great wealth in a major speech, the Puritan spirit and the regulation of corporations. Trying to restore confidence, he blamed the crisis primarily on Europe. But then, after saluting the unbending rectitude of the Puritans, he went on, "It may well be that the determination of the government to punish certain malefactors of great wealth has been responsible for something of the trouble, at least to the extent of having caused these men to combine to bring about as much financial stress as possible in order to discredit the policy of the government and thereby secure a reversal of that policy so that they may enjoy unmolested the fruits of their own evil doing." Regarding the very wealthy, Roosevelt privately scorned their entire unfitness to govern the country and the lasting damage they do by much of what they think are the legitimate big business operations of the day, foreign policy. In the analysis by Henry Kissinger, Roosevelt was the first president to develop the guideline that it was the duty of the United States to make its enormous power and potential influence felt globally. The idea of being a passive city on the hill model that others could look up to, he rejected. Roosevelt, trained in biology, was a social Darwinist who believed in survival of the fittest. The international world, in his view, was a realm of violence and conflict. The United States had all the economic and geographical potential to be the fittest nation on the globe. The United States had a duty to act decisively. For example, in terms of the Monroe Doctrine, the United States had to prevent European incursions in the Western Hemisphere. But there was more, as he expressed in his Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The US had to be the policeman of the region because unruly, corrupt, smaller nations had to be controlled, and if United States did not do it, European powers would in fact intervene and develop their own base of power in the hemisphere in contravention to the Monroe Doctrine. Roosevelt was a conservative realist in his foreign policy approach. He deplored many of the increasingly popular idealistic liberal themes, such as were promoted by William Jennings Bryan, the anti-imperialists, and Woodrow Wilson. Kissinger says he rejected the efficacy of international law. Roosevelt argued that if a country could not protect its own interests, the international community could not help very much. He ridiculed disarmament proposals that were increasingly common. He saw no likelihood of an international power capable of checking wrongdoing on a major scale. As for world government, I regard the Wilson-Bryan attitude of trusting to fantastic peace treaties, to impossible promises, to all kinds of scraps of paper, without any backing in efficient force, as abhorrent. It is infinitely better for a nation and for the world to have the Frederick the Great and Bismarck tradition as regards foreign policy than to have the Bryan or Bryan-Wilson attitude as a permanent national attitude. A milk and water righteousness unbacked by force is as wicked as, and even more mischievous than force divorced from righteousness. On his international outlook, Roosevelt favored spheres of influence, whereby one great power would generally prevail, such as the United States in the Western Hemisphere or Great Britain in the Indian subcontinent. Japan fit that role, and he approved. However, he had deep distrust of both Germany and Russia. Japan. The American annexation of Hawaii in 1898 was stimulated in part by fear that Japan would dominate or seize the Hawaiian Republic. Similarly, Germany was the alternative to American takeover of the Philippines in 1900, and Tokyo strongly preferred the US to take over. As the US became a naval world power, it needed to find a way to avoid a military confrontation in the Pacific with Japan. In the 1890s, Roosevelt had been an ardent imperialist and vigorously defended the permanent acquisition of the Philippines in the 1900 campaign. After the local insurrection ended in 1902, Roosevelt wished to have a strong US presence in the region as a symbol of democratic values, but he did not envision any new acquisitions. One of Roosevelt's priorities was the maintenance of friendly relations with Japan. From 1904 to 1905, Japan and Russia were at war. Both sides asked Roosevelt to mediate a peace conference, held successfully in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Though he proclaimed that the United States would be neutral during the russo-japanese war, Roosevelt secretly favored Imperial Japan to emerge victorious against the Russian Empire. In California, anti-Japanese hostility was growing, and Tokyo protested. Roosevelt negotiated a gentleman's agreement in 1907. It ended explicit discrimination against the Japanese, and Japan agreed not to allow unskilled immigrants into the United States. The Great White Fleet of American battleships visited Japan in 1908. Roosevelt intended to emphasize the superiority of the American fleet over the smaller Japanese navy, but instead of resentment, the visitors arrived to a joyous welcome. This goodwill facilitated the Root-Takahira Agreement of November 1908, which reaffirmed the status quo of Japanese control of Korea and American control of the Philippines. China. Following the Boxer Rebellion, foreign powers, including the United States, required China to pay indemnities as part of the Boxer Protocol. In 1908, Roosevelt appropriated these indemnities for the Boxer Indemnity Scholarships, which funded tens of thousands of Chinese students to study in the US over the next 40 years. Europe. Success in the war against Spain and the new empire, plus having the largest economy in the world, meant that the United States had emerged as a world power. Roosevelt searched for ways to win recognition for the position abroad. He also played a major role in mediating the first Moroccan crisis by calling the Algeciras Conference, which averted war between France and Germany. Roosevelt's presidency saw the strengthening of ties with Great Britain. The Great Rapprochement had begun with British support of the United States during the Spanish-American War, and it continued as Britain withdrew its fleet from the Caribbean in favor of directing most of its attention to the rising German naval threat. In 1901, Britain and the US signed the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, abrogating the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, which had prevented the US from constructing a canal connecting the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. The long-standing Alaska boundary dispute was settled on terms favorable to the US. As Roosevelt later put it, this settled the last serious trouble between the British Empire and ourselves, Latin America and the Panama Canal. As president, Roosevelt primarily directed the nation's overseas ambitions towards the Caribbean, especially locations that had a bearing on the defense of his pet project, the Panama Canal. Roosevelt also increased the size of the Navy, and by the end of his second term, the US had more battleships than any country other than Britain. The Panama Canal, when it opened in 1914, allowed the US Navy to rapidly move back and forth from the Pacific to the Caribbean to European waters. In December 1902, the Germans, British, and Italians blockaded the ports of Venezuela to force the repayment of delinquent loans. Roosevelt was particularly concerned about the motives of German Emperor Wilhelm II. He succeeded in getting the three nations to agree to arbitration by tribunal at The Hague and successfully diffused the crisis. The latitude granted to the Europeans by the arbiters was in part responsible for the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which the president issued in 1904. Chronic wrongdoing, or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society, may in America, as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. Two possible routes for an isthmus canal in Central America were under consideration: through Nicaragua and through Panama, which was then a rebellious district within Colombia. Roosevelt persuaded Congress to approve the Panamanian alternative, and a treaty was approved, only to be rejected by the Colombian government. When the Panamanians learned of this, a rebellion followed, was supported by Roosevelt, and succeeded. A treaty with the new Panama government for construction of the canal was reached in 1903. Roosevelt received criticism for paying the bankrupt Panama Canal Company and the new Panama Canal Company $40 million, equivalent to $1.12 billion in 2024, for the rights and equipment to build the canal. Critics charged that an American investor syndicate divided the large payment among themselves. There was also controversy over whether a French company engineer influenced Roosevelt in choosing the Panama route for the canal over the Nicaragua route. Roosevelt denied charges of corruption. In January 1909, Roosevelt, in an unprecedented move, brought criminal libel charges against the New York World and the Indianapolis News, known as the Roosevelt-Panama libel cases. Both cases were dismissed by U.S. district courts, and on January 3, 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the lower court's rulings. Historians are sharply critical of Roosevelt's criminal prosecutions of the newspapers, but are divided on whether actual corruption took place. In 1906, following a disputed election, an insurrection ensued in Cuba. Roosevelt sent Taft, the Secretary of War, to monitor the situation. He was convinced that he had the authority to unilaterally authorize Taft to deploy Marines if necessary, without congressional approval. Examining the work of numerous scholars, Ricard reports that the most striking evolution in the 21st century historiography of Theodore Roosevelt is the switch from a partial arraignment of the imperialist to a quasi-unanimous celebration of the master diplomatist. Recent works have underlined cogently Roosevelt's exceptional statesmanship in the construction of the nascent 20th century special relationship. The 26th president's reputation as a brilliant diplomatist and real politician has undeniably reached new heights in the 21st century. Yet, his Philippine policy still prompts criticism. On November 6, 1906, Roosevelt was the first president to depart the continental United States on an official diplomatic trip. Roosevelt made a 17-day trip to Panama and Puerto Rico. He visited the Panama Canal worksite and attended diplomatic receptions in both Panama and Puerto Rico. That's the complete article. If you made it this far, you'll love the rest of the channel. Subscribe for a new Wikipedia deep dive every single day. The next video is on screen now, and if there's a topic you want narrated, drop it in the comments. Thanks for watching.